Now, this poem is considered one of the most famous examples of romanticism in the English language and is frequently anthologized.
I am so confused. I need help, and I've been looking forward to this talk all week because I'm like, well, Una will explain it to me. He'll get it.
I don't know about that. Let's start with here, okay? Because sometimes you've expressed this to me before. When you learn about the story behind the poem, when you get the context, the history, where was writing at this time, and you infuse that into the work, sometimes that actually makes it more enjoyable. Sometimes that makes it more interesting. And I thought this is one of those poems, those pieces, where when you learn a little bit more about the backstory, it actually gets more and more interesting.
It has to, right? Because I feel like old Sammy here gave me something that is an incoherent dream on the surface, and you got to dig deep to understand this. And I always say it, and I know you said I've gotten better, but I struggle with poetry, and I struggle with not the purpose. I understand the purpose is emotion, but I struggle with my own emotion. So for something like this, that I feel like is so wrapped up in emotion, it breaks my brain.
Well, let's say this. Your favorite like era, your favorite like way of expressing it's not romanticism, right? In terms of the emotions, in terms of getting caught up and doing what feels good, in terms of the very
definitely
descriptive,
not my love language. Yeah,
definitely not your love language in terms of being the specific. So, but I think it's important that it exists. I think for some people it attracts them, right? And it's okay for us to challenge ourselves, for looking deeper and to continue to try to understand different modes of how humanity has expressed themselves through time.
Of course, because that's how you're going to help connect with other people, that there is their love language, or that is the way that they express or understand love or feelings or emotions. So that can help you communicate better. And that's one of the great purposes of any type of literature, especially I feel like poems, is communication.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of the background here, because this is amazing. So so here's the story, and let's double click past this, right? So the surface level story is that, he tells us that, I was doing some anodynes, some opium. Okay. I was a prescribed drug, if you will. I was reading Purchases His Pilgrimages or whatever. And basically I fell asleep. Right. And I fell asleep right at this line where it's talking about how Kubla Khan, he's building, his Xanadu, his perfect city, if you will. He wakes up. He's like, oh my gosh, that dream was amazing. He tries to write some of it down. He's interrupted. And I can't remember the whole thing anymore. So it's kind of like an incomplete poem. And he didn't even publish it right away. Like it was like decades later that he actually was kind of elbowed into finally publishing it. So that's the surface level story that I think most people hear when it comes to how this story is presented, right?
Okay. And do you think that is unfair to us as readers? Because I know that I've had a dream before, and I don't know if I do it on purpose, but I feel like my imagination may fill in some of the gray areas so that my dream sounds more coherent when I tell my wife, or I tell you, or, my friend, my sister or something. And I'll be like, I had this crazy dream, blah, 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 blah. And a couple of those blah, blah, blahs aren't really from the dream, but just my imagination trying to make it a little bit more coherent so they can follow it.
Oh, 100%. That's a well-known psychological element, right? And that's even taken into consideration with police procedure. When a crime occurs, well, okay, you could have one witness, but if you've got 2, 3, 4, 5 witnesses, you need to talk to all of them, because that's when you start to see the cracks in the stories. One person thought the murderer had orange hair, but these 4 said, no, he was blonde, right? So you have more evidence that, actually it was blonde. But then this guy over here actually agrees with half of these people over here that, he was 6 feet tall, while 2 of these people say, no, he was real short. He was like 4'11". You start to realize that people don't have the full idea of a memory. And there's some, like, I think he uses the word gap somewhere, but there is a gap fill that kind of happens with us to I guess comfort ourselves, to make ourselves feel more comfortable. I don't know, it's entering more psychology than I can remember, but I do remember Professor Dowd, thanks Teach, that he kind of taught us about this in the psychology class, that we absolutely gap fill our memories.
So I have to think of and wonder, with a story like this that obviously has been influenced by a dream, been influenced by drugs, and influenced by the psychology that you just spoke about, which stanzas can we believe and which are those gap fillers? And does that matter? As is my question, because I struggled with the poem overall, trying to pull that meaning out and analyze it, because that's what my brain does every time.
Yeah. Well, the story gets even more interesting, right? Because let's think about it this way. You have writers that write something down, and you have those that just plow through it. We're going to come back. We're going to hit it on that second draft, right? And you have some that just like really try to fine tune and craft it as they write it. And they might come back and tweak a few things, but you always have that revisiting over time. Well, what happened between 1797 and when this actually got published? Because I guess Coleridge, he never wrote down the date for when he actually wrote this. And scholars debate this in terms of, like, did he really write it in 1797? Well, most of them agree it was around then, because in terms of like the way he expressed himself in letters, when he would actually acknowledge it and not acknowledge it, because he didn't write about it very often in letters. Like, he would only reveal it to specific close friends, if you will, like private readings. And that's one element. But now let's start to talk about that gap fill, right? Because how much changed over time, even though we do have access to the original manuscript. It's on display in like some British library or museum, I think, somewhere. But if you think about it, he claims, I was reading this book. But the book spelled Kubla Khan with like C's different than how he wrote Kubla Khan. The book was also possibly 1,000 pages, which would be very unwieldy to be sitting out and have carried out into this field, to have just been on opium and then suddenly read this line and start writing this poem essentially as well. And it's also questionable of, okay, why did you misquote the part of the book where it actually has more in common with Marco Polo's letters of Xanadu than it did the book that you claim that you're quoting? There's a lot of inconsistencies where some gap fills appear to have happened with this story. So how much of this story really was just written down on a whim versus did he craft, and we only have access to maybe the final manuscript, the one that finally got, like, oh yeah, this is my manuscript from 1797. It becomes a little bit more controversial of what is the true source of what did Samuel Taylor Coleridge really see in his dream.
I can't remember my best dream ever from a month ago, let alone if it's been years. Even if it's the most profound, best dream you've ever had in your entire life, that memory is going to fade eventually. Our brains just don't work that way. Again, but does it all matter? Because there is a piece of literature here that I can read and I can analyze and I can try to pull information out of. I just struggled to do that because I had all this excess baggage. And I think that if I hadn't known that, maybe it would have been easier. And I feel like that's something of like, I wish I could undo sometimes. And you've been such a service to me of telling me, hey, don't read this first, or let's have this discussion before you read this, because that allows you to dive deeper into it. And I think this is a poem of, you just need to go in blind and just read it without any preconceived notions of what is truly there.
Well, it's going to break your brain too, right? Like when we talk about building this sunny palace, this beautiful palace, perfect palace, but it's in really long caves, but we clear out the land and there's gardens in there. I don't know many gardens that grow in caves, really. I don't know many sunny pleasure domes in caves. There's this juxtaposition of like impossibility, even in the language, right? When he says like the 2 fives of fertile ground, and we could talk all day about the alliteration.
The milks of paradise.
Yeah. Well, and yeah, obviously there's ton to discuss there and how you want to approach literature, right? Do you want to talk about the beauty of the language and the assonance and the consonants? And that's not really where you and I get the most amount of pleasure. Maybe that's part of why romanticism is as high on our list as it is for others. we like to talk about the meaning, the purpose. So, okay, why would Coleridge make these impossibilities? The gardens in the dark caves, but it's a sunny palace in that dark cave. Like, it can't be sunny and dark. Which one is it? Right. And we learn in the second stanza and the third stanza, they're ice caves. How can it be cold, but like hot at the same time too? Like, this is something that can't happen. Why would he specifically make such a juxtaposition of the perfect world?
We've talked a lot about man versus nature, man coexisting with nature. And I feel like this might have been his attempt at saying that man can control or tame nature in some regards, and that you can have a square circle, so to speak, and that we can capture and control our environments.
Okay. Let's go back to your history days, as you used to teach history, right? Why did Genghis Khan conquer?
The trade routes, to control the trade routes, because that was where the power lied.
Mm-hmm. And what was the vision that made him believe that? Like, what ordained him to go on these conquests? Why control these routes?
He felt that, he was destined to do it, and that was something he wanted to do for his family and his culture, and spread his, belief of how the world should operate.
I mean, are you aware that there are Mongolian texts that say that Genghis Khan thought he was ordered by the heavens to rule Earth? Like, he believed it was his destiny to conquer and build almost like this perfect environment.
I think that all conquerors kind of believe that.
On some level, right?
Yeah, on some level, I think that, the narcissism gets to him at some point of that, God destined me to do this. So I guess I could see that as a little bit of in the poem as well.
Now, we've also talked about how obviously Kubla Khan's a real person. Is it the great-grandson, the grandson of Genghis Khan, a descendant of Genghis Khan?
Great-grandson, yeah.
Okay. So, he's trying to create his perfect world. He hears his ancestors tell him that war's coming, right? Well, what's Coleridge's point of life, right? We've talked before about how literature is a way to immortalize yourself, right? The idea being, if I create this perfect book, this perfect narrative, it'll be passed down, and therefore I will be in the consciousness of human beings for decades, for centuries, right? What better way to continue living on your isness, your essence of yourself, than creating the perfect thing to let you live on in the legacy of other people? Whether you're doing it through the conquering, like Genghis Khan thought was right, through the building of the perfect city, like Kubla Khan, or whether you're like Samuel Taylor Coleridge here, where you think that your way of living on and making the legacy for yourself for future generations is through poetry. In some ways, we're all kind of driven to create this perfect reality, even if it is an impossibility in the way that this poem has come across.
And I do want to correct myself real quick. It's his grandson. But yeah, I feel like the poem, you get through all the poem and you're kind of in this fever dream with Coolidge. And then you get to the end and there's a juxtaposition on top of juxtaposition of it shifts, right? And you get the realism where it starts to make a little bit more coherent sense, and you realize that there's been a change in a tone, and it almost feels like a different author as you get to the end of the poem.
Really? I was with you when you said the word juxtaposition, right? Because in the beginning, it's all beautiful, we're crafting, we're creating, and then the second word, they talk about the satanic howls of this woman, and we learn about the dulcimer and the Abyssinian woman who played it. Like, oh, I have this recollection of her. If I could just recreate that perfect sound for my perfect city, to me, and there's that geyser that's spitting stones out. First of all, why do I want a geyser spitting stones out? My perfect city, that seems hot, right? Juxtaposition, right? But to me, it continued this absurdity throughout the whole poem. And even the way the tone shift matches the way the elements of the story are absolutely absurd as well. That to me, the way the poem ended was very abrupt, right? Like it is an incomplete poem. Like, we admit that. Like, he tells us it's an incomplete poem. And I wonder how much of that is that idea too of he couldn't create perfection. Like he failed to immortalize this perfect poem for himself, even though people have debated and found fascination, whether it be in the wordplay or the meaning or what is this perfect world and why do we create this perfect world? Like there's so many different ways to kind of attack this one.
And I feel like that's something that we've talked a lot about before, maybe more off camera than on, of is there ever a perfect ending to a story? Is there ever a perfect ending to a book, a poem, a movie, a show? Because ultimately, you're probably going to disappoint someone, right? So had Coleridge sat down and he had the final stanza and he's like, this isn't going to work. He goes, 99% of people may love it, but I want 100%. I want everybody to be content with this. And he torched it. He threw it away. He burnt it. He buried it. And so leaving us wanting, having that open-ended story like so many authors do, letting us finish it is sometimes the greatest gift they can give to the story, as leaving it open-ended, leaving it incomplete. And I feel like that's what he's done here as well. Of that incoherent ramblings throughout, is if you had a coherent ending, it would break the magic of the poem itself. And even though I struggled with it, I really did, and our discussion has helped, I feel like that's something of why people keep going back to this poem over and over, so many years later.
It's a hard poem, right? There's no two ifs, ands, or buts about it. The imagery is intense. The way reality doesn't exactly fit perfectly is intense. It's hard to absorb, I think, as a reader. And some people, I think, like that feeling, and there's just so much of Coleridge just injected into it, because I think I got to look up the dates, but there's like at one point in his life, I think it was when he was younger, he wanted to create or tried to create this like utopian society, right? Like pantasocracy, or I don't know, look it up in some history book on Coleridge, but there's an element of him wanting to reach perfection, this utopian society, this perfect poem, this Xanadu, which can have sunny pleasure domes in icy caves, apparently.
Yeah, right. I always think about and come back to the idea of, we talked about a lot of different authors over the years, and we've come to a few of our favorites that always seem to have used mind-altering stimulants. And is that something that is consistent of why authors write the way that they do? And is it their true word that we're really getting? And I feel like with Coleridge, he wanted something perfect and he couldn't have it, so he teased us with it in this poem.
Have you ever read The Rime of the Ancient Mariner?
Ooh, that sounds very familiar. I might have in high school or college.
There's an Iron Maiden song that even like paid homage to it.
I definitely didn't listen to that. I definitely didn't listen to that.
I'll say this. This poem is so different from The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Like the way that they come off, the style. Even as someone that is using, these altering substances to write, it's clear that Kubla Khan is just in a different sport than a lot of his other writings have been. Maybe that's something I'll schedule for us to do, but it'll be interesting to kind of compare and contrast to kind of what you just brought up, because you can see the artistry and the tone, the register, the style, it's completely different. I'll schedule that, tell you what, playlist down below to follow along as we plan on doing that one here in the near future to catch up on that one. Let us know what you enjoyed about this poem. Obviously, we could go all night about this. There's a ton to talk about here, but I hope you enjoyed the conversation. If you did, leave us a little picture of a palace. How about that down below to let YouTube know that you enjoyed it. My name is Ben Una. Thank you for spending time with us today.
Peace.